The phone rang at 12:17 a.m., and before I even opened my eyes, I knew something was wrong. At 64, you learn that nobody calls after midnight to share good news. I was asleep in my recliner, an old habit I'd picked up after retirement. My left knee was throbbing from the cold weather again, and the television was still glowing across the living room. When I saw Rebecca's name on my phone, I answered before the second ring finished. "Dad." Her voice cracked. For one terrifying second, I thought something had happened to Noah or Grace. I sat up so fast my knee screamed in protest. "Rebecca, what's wrong?" Silence, then I heard her crying. Not the kind of crying people do when they're embarrassed or frustrated. This was real, broken, the kind that comes from somewhere deep. "Dad," she whispered, "why is your face on every news station?" I stared at the television across the room. An overnight local broadcast was playing with the volume low. I looked back at my phone, suddenly wide awake. "What are you talking about?" "You were on Channel 7. Stephen found another video online. Everybody's sharing it." My hand stung where I'd scraped it earlier that night. I rubbed my eyes, hoping I was still asleep. "Rebecca, slow down." She took a shaky breath. "Dad, I didn't know." The moment she said those 4 words, I understood exactly what she meant. Because 6 hours earlier, my daughter had asked me not to come for Christmas. Strange as it sounds, that wasn't even the worst conversation we'd ever had. The worst conversations aren't usually loud. They don't involve shouting or slammed doors. They happen quietly, with ordinary words that somehow stay with you forever. 3 days earlier, I had been sitting alone at my kitchen table in Toledo, Ohio, paying bills and pretending retirement was everything people promised it would be. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I'd been divorced from Margaret for 15 years, long enough to learn how to live alone. You develop routines. You make coffee for one person. You cook too much food and eat leftovers for days. You talk to the dog. Then the dog dies, and eventually, you start talking to yourself. Life doesn't necessarily get worse. It just gets smaller. The brightest part of my life had always been Rebecca and the grandchildren. At least, that's what I believed. I still remembered teaching Rebecca how to ride a bicycle behind our church. I remembered sitting through dance recitals that felt longer than military campaigns. I remembered helping her move into her first apartment, then helping her move out, and later helping her move again. That's what fathers do. Or at least, that's what I thought. When my phone rang that afternoon and I saw Rebecca's name, I smiled before answering. "Hey kiddo, hi dad." Something felt wrong immediately. Parents never lose that instinct. Your child can be 37 years old, and you'll still recognize pain in their voice before they do. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah, too fast." Then, silence. I leaned back in my chair and stared out at the snow collecting beside the mailbox. "What is it?" Another pause. Finally, she said the sentence that changed everything. "Mom and Stephen are hosting Christmas this year." And somehow, before she said another word, I already knew I wasn't invited. Maybe it was the hesitation in her voice. Maybe it was the fact that she had mentioned Stephen's name before mentioning mine. Or maybe fathers simply know when they're being gently pushed out of their own lives. "What time should I come over?" I asked anyway. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds. It felt like a lifetime. "Dad," she said softly, "maybe this year it would be better if you stayed home." Outside my window, snow drifted across the empty street. Inside, something much quieter broke apart. I looked toward the Christmas tree standing in the corner of my living room. Several handmade ornaments Rebecca had created in elementary school still hung from its branches. For reasons I couldn't yet explain, I suddenly found it difficult to breathe. I never saw it coming. Thomas Bennett sat very still after Rebecca's words. The Christmas tree lights blinked quietly in the corner of the room, completely unaware that anything had changed. For several seconds, I honestly wondered if I had misunderstood her. "Stay home?" I asked. Rebecca cleared her throat. "Dad, please don't take it personally. We're trying to make Stephen feel more like part of the family this year." There it was. Not anger, not cruelty, something worse. Replacement. I looked at the crooked clay angel Rebecca had made in 3rd grade. I'd kept it for nearly 30 years. Apparently, I'd held on to some things longer than other people had. "I understand," I heard myself say. "Really?" The hope in her voice almost broke me. "Sure," I lied. We spoke for another minute about nothing important. The weather, traffic, the children. Then the call ended. I sat alone at the kitchen table long after the screen went dark. The strange thing was, I wasn't angry. Not immediately. Mostly, I felt tired. Not the kind of tired sleep fixes. The kind that settles somewhere behind your ribs after years of pretending disappointment doesn't hurt. The next morning, I went shopping anyway. I bought a remote control truck for Noah, an art set for Grace. Then I spent almost an hour walking through a bookstore before buying Rebecca a leather-bound photo album. Not because she needed another photo album. Because I needed her to remember. For the next 2 evenings, I sat at my dining room table, sorting through 30 years of photographs. Birthday parties, school plays, fishing trips, graduations, vacations. There were pictures she'd probably forgotten existed. Pictures of scraped knees and missing teeth. Pictures of dance recitals and science fairs. Pictures of a little girl who used to run toward me instead of away from difficult conversations. Sometimes I smiled. Sometimes I had to stop working for a while. By Christmas Eve morning, the album was finished. On the final page, I wrote a single sentence: "No matter where I spend Christmas, you'll always be my little girl." Then I wrapped everything carefully and loaded the gifts into my old Ford pickup. I told myself I was only dropping them off. No speeches, no guilt, no surprises, just one final fatherly obligation. The drive across Toledo took 30 minutes. Snow drifted across the roads. Christmas music played softly through the speakers. Every traffic light seemed to last longer than usual. When I finally pulled into Rebecca's neighborhood, I sat in the truck for almost 10 minutes. Through the front windows, I could see the Christmas tree. I could see people moving around. I could hear laughter. For one dangerous moment, I considered walking to the front door. Just knocking. Just asking. Just hoping. Instead, I picked up the gifts. I carried them to the porch and placed them carefully beside the front door. The photo album sat on top. I stood there longer than necessary. Then, I turned around and walked away. The entire visit lasted less than 2 minutes. It still managed to break my heart. Back home, I spent the afternoon pretending I wasn't waiting for my phone to ring. It never did. By 7:30 that evening, loneliness had started whispering dangerous ideas. I put on my coat, picked up my keys, walked to the front door, and for one terrible second I almost went back. What stopped me wasn't pride, it was knowing I was no longer welcome. Then my phone buzzed. Not Rebecca. A text message from Hope Harbor Community Shelter. Winter weather conditions were worsening. Additional volunteers might be needed overnight. I stared at the message for a long time. Most people imagine loneliness as an empty room. They are wrong. Loneliness is having somewhere to go and realizing nobody is waiting for you there. I texted back 3 words. On my way. 20 minutes later, I was driving downtown through falling snow, heading toward a shelter full of strangers. At the time, I believed I was simply volunteering. I had no way of knowing that before the night ended, a church bus, a television camera, and one honest sentence would change everything I thought I knew about family. The shelter was already crowded when I arrived. The old church building that housed Hope Harbor had become a refuge for anyone trying to escape the storm. Elderly residents from an apartment complex with failing heat sat wrapped in donated blankets. Several homeless men crowded around the coffee station. Volunteers moved between tables, carrying food, blankets, and whatever comfort they could offer. I hung my coat by the entrance and did what I'd always done. I worked. For the next 2 hours, I fixed a thermostat that refused to cooperate, moved folding tables, made coffee, and listened to stories from people who mostly needed someone willing to listen. That's the thing about loneliness. Once you've lived with it long enough, you become better at recognizing it in other people. By 10:30, the storm had worsened. Snow hammered the windows, the roads were turning dangerous. The shelter director insisted I stay the night. I refused. "Somebody has to feed the birds in the morning," I joked. He laughed. I didn't tell him that going home to an empty house had somehow become part of surviving. The roads were nearly deserted as I drove north. Snow swirled through my headlights. Visibility dropped with every mile. About 15 minutes from home, I saw flashing hazard lights. At first, I thought it was a stranded car. Then I got closer. A church shuttle bus sat partially in a ditch, tilted at an angle that made my stomach tighten. Several passengers were visible through the windows. I pulled over immediately. Years working emergency utility repairs had trained me to react before thinking. I called 911, turned on my emergency flashers, then stepped into the storm. The wind hit me hard enough to steal my breath. Inside the bus, people were frightened, mostly older adults. One woman was crying. Another man clutched his shoulder. The driver was trying to remain calm, but I could see panic beginning to spread. "My name's Thomas," I said loudly. "Help is on the way." Something changed when I said those words, not because they trusted me, because they needed to trust somebody. I moved through the bus, checking on passengers, asking questions, keeping people talking. Then I saw the utility pole. Years of experience made the danger obvious immediately. A power line had dropped lower than it should have, not touching the bus. Not yet, but close enough that my blood ran cold. "Nobody leaves this bus," I said. The driver looked confused. "Sir?" "Trust me," I answered. "Nobody moves." He must have heard something in my voice because he nodded without arguing. The next 20 minutes passed slowly. Snow piled around the tires. People shivered. I kept talking about sports, about grandchildren, about terrible cafeteria food, anything to keep fear from taking over. When emergency crews finally arrived, relief swept through the bus like a physical force. Firefighters secured the area. EMTs checked passengers. Eventually, after they determined it was safe, I helped 2 elderly women carefully step down onto the roadside. One kept apologizing for moving too slowly. "You remind me of my aunt," I told her. She laughed. Then my foot found black ice. I went down hard. Pain exploded through my left knee. For a second, I couldn't breathe. A firefighter helped me up. "You okay?" "Depends," I said through clenched teeth. "How old do I look?" He laughed. I didn't, because suddenly, I felt every one of my 64 years. An empty cleaned a deep scrape on my hand while another looked at my knee. Somewhere nearby, television cameras arrived. I barely noticed. I was cold, exhausted, and all I wanted was to go home. A young reporter approached with a microphone. "Sir, can I ask you a few questions?" I shrugged. "Sure," I answered automatically. How did I know what to do? Years of experience. Why did I stop? Because somebody needed help. Did I have family waiting for me tonight? That question caught me off guard. For just a second, I thought about Rebecca, about Noah and Grace opening presents, about the photo album sitting on a table somewhere inside a warm house. Then I smiled. Not because I was happy, because sometimes smiling hurts less than telling the truth. Not tonight, I said. The reporter looked surprised. No Christmas plans? Snow blew across the highway, and without realizing it, I said the sentence that would change my life. My daughter asked me not to come this year. By the time I got home, it was after midnight. My knee had swollen enough to make walking difficult. My hand was wrapped in gauze. The house looked exactly the way I'd left it, quiet, still, and painfully familiar. I lowered myself into my recliner and closed my eyes. Then my phone started vibrating. Once, twice, 10 times. I thought maybe there had been another accident. Instead, I saw Rebecca's name. Dad, she said the moment I answered. She was crying again. Why didn't you tell me? I looked at the television. The local station was replaying footage from the crash scene. There I was, standing beside the stranded bus while snow whipped across the highway. Tell you what? I asked. Where you were. What happened? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because 6 hours earlier she'd told me exactly where I wasn't supposed to be. I didn't think it mattered, I said. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything we'd said all week. We ended the call awkwardly, no apology, no explanation, just sadness. Then Margaret called. My ex-wife rarely sounded uncertain, but that night she did. I saw the news, she said quietly. I'm okay. Rebecca feels terrible. I stared at the television. The station replayed the footage again. I imagine she does. Margaret sighed. It was the sound of someone realizing that some mistakes don't disappear simply because you regret them. 5 minutes later, Stephen called. Of course he did. Thomas, he said cheerfully, quite a night, huh? I closed my eyes. He talked about the weather, the rescue, the news coverage, how crazy everything was. Then, finally, he said what he'd actually called to say. Rebecca didn't mean to hurt you. I said nothing. Because whether she intended to hurt me had stopped mattering the moment she asked me to stay home. The next morning, my phone exploded. Former coworkers, neighbors, church members, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Everyone had apparently seen the story. Around noon, an old friend sent me a link. Have you watched this yet? I clicked. The video wasn't about the rescue. Not really. It was 20 seconds long. 20 seconds that somehow changed everything. The reporter stood beside me in the snow. Do you have family waiting for you tonight? I smiled. Not tonight. No Christmas plans? I shook my head. My daughter asked me not to come this year. That was it. No anger, no blame, just truth. Yet somehow, millions of people understood exactly what I meant. The comments flooded in, stories about estranged children, divorce, loneliness, growing older, being forgotten. People weren't talking about the rescue. They were talking about abandonment, about fathers, about the terrible silence that settles over a house when everyone you love is somewhere else. By evening, local radio stations were discussing it. Community pages were sharing it. Complete strangers were defending me. I hated every minute of it, and yet secretly I understood, because nobody talks honestly about loneliness after 60. Especially men. That afternoon, Rebecca texted me. 3 words. Can we talk? I stared at the message for nearly 10 minutes. Before I could answer, another text arrived. Dad, I found the photo album. My chest tightened. She had reached the final page. She had read the note. For several minutes, I simply sat there. Then another call came. A reporter. Not from television, from a newspaper. Her name was Olivia Carter. And according to her, the story everyone thought was about a rescue wasn't actually about a rescue at all. It was about me. I told her she was wrong. A month later, I would discover she wasn't. And unfortunately, neither was the rest of the country. I ignored Olivia Carter's first 3 calls. Not because I disliked reporters. I simply didn't understand why anyone would want to write a story about a retired utility worker with a bad knee and an even worse Christmas. Eventually, I answered, "Mr. Bennett, it's Thomas." "Thomas," she said, "I'm not interested in the rescue." That got my attention. "Then, what are you interested in?" "The people who keep talking about you." Over the next 30 minutes, Olivia explained that she'd been interviewing everyone connected to the story. Former coworkers, neighbors, people from Hope Harbor, passengers from the church bus, and apparently, they all had stories. A widow whose furnace I'd repaired for free during a winter storm. A trade school scholarship fund I'd quietly supported for years. A shelter director who informed me I'd volunteered there for almost 12 years. 12? I hadn't realized it had been that long. "I don't understand," I told her. "None of that matters." She laughed softly. "I think that's exactly why it matters." A week later, her article was published. And somehow, things became even stranger. Rebecca started calling every day. Not dramatic conversations, just small ones. How was my knee? Had my hand healed? Was I eating properly? For years, I'd been the one making those calls. Now, suddenly, she was. The strange part was that I no longer felt desperate for them. Not because I stopped loving my daughter. Because I had finally stopped measuring my worth by how often she remembered me. A few weeks later, she asked if we could have lunch. I said yes. She looked tired when she arrived, older, not physically. Emotionally, we sat in a small diner outside Toledo and spent almost 20 minutes talking about everything except Christmas. Finally, she put down her coffee. "Dad," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." I waited. I spent so much time trying to keep Mom happy and trying to make Stephen feel included that I never stopped to think about what I was doing to you. The restaurant noise faded, not because the room became quieter, because honesty has a way of making everything else disappear. "I know," I said. She looked down. "I found the photo album that night." I nodded. "I know." I cried. For hours. For the first time since Christmas, I believed her. Not because she was crying. Because she wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was accepting responsibility. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The words were simple, but real apologies usually are. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Thank you." She started crying again. What happens now? That was the question, wasn't it? Not whether I loved her. I always would. The question was whether love automatically repaired what had been broken. "I don't know," I answered honestly. She nodded. And somehow, that honesty felt kinder than false reassurance. The months that followed weren't magical. There were no movie moments, no dramatic speeches, no perfect family photographs. Instead, there were phone calls, dinners, awkward conversations. Small acts of effort, the kind that matter more than grand gestures. I updated my will. I continued volunteering. I stopped solving problems that weren't mine to solve. And slowly, something unexpected happened. I became happy, not because my family changed, because I changed. The following autumn, I received an invitation to the Ohio Community Service Excellence Awards. One guest allowed. Everyone assumed I'd invite Rebecca. Instead, I invited Charlotte Hayes, one of the elderly women from the church bus. She accepted immediately and complained about the parking situation before we even left Toledo. At the ceremony, when they called my name, Charlotte squeezed my arm and whispered, "Don't fall. It'll embarrass both of us." I laughed harder than I had in years. On the drive home, my phone buzzed. A message from Rebecca. "Proud of you, Dad." I smiled. Then I put the phone away. Not because I didn't care. Because I finally understood something I wish I'd learned years earlier. Love should never require begging. Family can forget your value. Strangers can remind you. But eventually, if you're lucky, you learn to remember it for yourself.